Hello again, fifth graders. My name is Mrs. Destry, and I'm here to read you a few chapters out of my favorite book, Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech. So now we are on chapter 5. If you've missed my other chapters, go back on YouTube and watch the others to catch up, okay? A damsel in distress. At this point in my story about Phoebe, Graham said, I knew somebody like Phoebe once. Phoebe, I said. Yes, that's right. I knew someone just like Phoebe, only her name was Gloria. Gloria lived in the wildest, most pepped-up world, a scary one, but oh, scads more exciting than my own. Graham said, Gloria? Is she the one who told you not to marry me? Is she the one who said I would be your ruination? Shush, Graham said. Gloria was right about that, at least. She elbowed Gramps. Besides, Gloria only said that because she wanted you for herself. Gall dang, Gramps said, pulling into a rest stop on the Ohio Turnpike. I'm tired. I did not want to stop. Rush, 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 whispered the wind, and the sky and the clouds, the trees. Rush, rush, rush. If all he wanted to do was take a rest, that seemed safe enough and quick enough thing for him to do. My grandparents can get into trouble as easily as a fly can land on a watermelon. 2 years ago, when they drove to Washington, D.C., they were arrested for stealing the back tires off of a senator's car. We had 2 flat, sprunkled tires, my grandfather explained. We were only borrowing the senator's tires. We were going to return them. In Bybanks, Kentucky, you could do this. You could borrow someone's back tires and return them later. But you could not do this in Washington, D.C., and you could not do this to a senator's car. Last year, when Grandma Gramps drove to Philadelphia, they were stopped by the police for irresponsible driving. You were driving on the shoulder, a policeman told Gramps. Gramps said, shoulder? I thought it was an extra lane. That's a mighty fine shoulder. So here we were, just a few hours into our trip out to Lewiston, Idaho, and we were safely stopped in a rest area. Then, Gramps noticed a woman leaning over the fender of her car. The woman was peering at her engine and dabbing a white handkerchief at various greasy items inside. Excuse me, Gramps said gallantly. I believe I see a damsel in some distress, and he marched off to her rescue. Gramps sat there patting her knees and singing, Oh, meet me in the tulips when the tulips do bloom. The woman's white handkerchief, now spotted with black grease, dangled from her fingertips as she smiled down on the back of Gramps, who had taken her place leaning over the engine. Might be the car busterator, he said, or maybe not. He tapped a few of the hoses. Might be these dang snakes, he said. Oh my, the woman said, snakes? In my engine? Gramps waggled a hose. See, this here is what I call a snake, he said. Oh, I see, said the woman. And you think those snakes might be my problem? Maybe so. Gramps pulled one off, and it came loose. See there, he said, it's off. Well, yes, but you dang snakes, Gramps said, pulling at another one. It came loose. Looky there, another one. The woman smiled a thin, little, worried smile. But 2 hours later, there was not a single snake still attached to anything to which it was supposed to be attached. The car busterator lay dismantled on the ground. Various other pieces of the woman's engine were scattered here and there. The woman called a mechanic, and once Gramps was satisfied that the mechanic was an honest man who might actually be able to repair her vehicle, we started on our trip again. Salamanca, Gramps said, tell us more about Phoebe. Phoebe, I said. Phoebe Winterbottom. Yes, that's right, Gramps said. Phoebe. Chapter 6, Blackberries. What was the diabolic thing that happened to Mr. Cadaver, Gramps said. You didn't tell us that yet. I explained that just as Phoebe was going to divulge the purely awful thing that had happened to Mr. Cadaver, her father came home from work and we all sat down to dinner. Me, Phoebe, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom, and Phoebe's sister, Prudence. Phoebe's parents reminded me a lot of my other grandparents, the Pickfords. Like the Pickfords, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom spoke quietly in short sentences and sat straight up as they ate their food. They were extremely polite to each other, saying, yes, Norma, and yes, George, and would you please pass the potatoes, Phoebe? And wouldn't your guests like another helping? They were picky about their food. Everything they ate was what my father would call a side dish. Potatoes, zucchini, bean salad, and a mystery casserole that I could not identify. They didn't eat meat and they didn't use butter. They were very concerned about cholesterol. From what I could gather, Mr. Winterbottom worked in an office creating road maps. Mrs. Winterbottom baked and cleaned and did laundry and grocery shopping. I had a funny feeling that Mrs. Winterbottom did not actually like all of this baking and cleaning and laundry and shopping, and I'm not quite sure why I had this feeling, because if you just listen to the words she said, it sounded as if she was Mrs. Supreme Housewife. For example, at one point, Mrs. Winterbottom said, "I believe I've made more pies in the past week than I can count." She said this in a cheery voice, but afterwards, in the small silence when no one commented on her pies, she gave a soft sigh and looked down at her plate. I thought it was odd that she baked all those pies when she seemed so concerned about cholesterol. A little later, she said, "I couldn't find exactly the brand of muesli you liked, George, but I bought something similar." Mr. Winterbottom kept eating, and again, in that silence, Mrs. Winterbottom sighed and examined her plate. I was happy for her when she announced that since Phoebe and Prudence were back in school, she thought she would return to work. Apparently, during the school term, she worked part-time at Rocky's Rubber as a receptionist. When no one commented on her going back to work, she sighed again and poked at her potatoes. A few times, Mrs. Winterbottom called her husband Sweetie Pie and Honey Bun. She said, "Would you like more zucchini, Sweetie Pie? And did I make enough potatoes, Honey Bun?" For some reason, that surprised me, those little names she used. She was dressed in a plain brown skirt and white blouse. On her feet were sensible, wide, flat shoes. She did not wear makeup, even though she had a pleasant round face and long, curly yellow hair. The main impression I got was that she was used to being plain and ordinary, and that she was not supposed to do anything too shocking. And Mr. Winterbottom was playing the role of father with a capital F. He sat at the head of the table, and his white shirt cuffs rolled back neatly. He still wore his red and blue striped tie. His expression was serious, his voice was deep, and his words were very clear. "Yes, Norma," he said deeply and clearly. "No, Norma." He looked more like 52 than 38, but this was not something that I would ever call to his or Phoebe's attention. Phoebe's sister Prudence was 17 years old, but she acted like her mother. She ate primly, she nodded politely, and she smiled after everything she said. It all seemed peculiar. They acted so thumpingly tidy and respectable. After dinner, Phoebe walked me home. She said, "You wouldn't think it to look at her, but Mrs. Cadaver is as strong as an ox." Phoebe looked behind her as if she expected someone to be following us. "I have seen her chop down trees and lug the remains clear across her backyard. Do you know what I think? I think maybe she killed Mr. Cadaver and chopped him up and buried him in the backyard." "Phoebe," I said. "I'm just telling you what I think, that's all." That night, I lay in bed. I thought about Mrs. Cadaver, and I wanted to believe that she was capable of killing her husband and chopping him into pieces and burying him in her backyard. And then I started thinking about the blackberries, and I remembered a time my mother and I walked around the rims of the fields and the pastures in Bybanks picking blackberries. We did not pick from the bottom of the vine or from the top. The ones at the bottom were for the rabbits, my mother said, and the ones at the top were for the birds. The ones at people height were for people. Lying in bed, remembering those blackberries made me think of something else too. It was something that had happened a couple years ago on a morning when my mother slept late. It was that time she was pregnant. My father had already eaten breakfast and he was out in the fields. On the table, my father had left a single flower in each of 2 juice glasses, a black-eyed Susan in front of my place and a white petunia in front of my mother's. When my mother came into the kitchen that day, she said, "Glory!" She bent her face forward to each flower. "Let's go find him." We climbed the hill to the barn, crawled between the fence wires, and crossed the field. My father was standing at the far end of the field, his back to us, hands on his hips, looking at a section of fence. My mother slowed down when she saw him. I was right behind her, and she looked as if she wanted to creep up and surprise him, so I was quiet too and cautious in my steps. I could hardly keep from giggling. It seemed so daring to be sneaking up on my father, and I was sure my mother was going to throw her arms around him and kiss him and hug him and tell him how much she loved the flower on the kitchen table. My mother always loved anything that normally grows or lives outdoors. Anything. Lizards, trees, cows, caterpillars, birds, flowers, crickets, toads, ants, pigs. Just before we reached my father, he turned around. This startled my mother and threw her off her guard. She stopped. "Sugar," he said. My mother opened her mouth, and I was thinking, come on, throw your arms around him, tell him. Before she could speak, my father pointed to the fence and said, "Look at that, a morning's work." He indicated a new length of wire strung between two new posts. There was sweat on his arms and face. And when I saw that my mother was crying, and my father saw it too. "What?" he said. "Oh, you're too good, John," she said. "You're too good. All you Hiddles are too good. I'll never be good. I'll never be able to think of all of the things." My father looked down at me. "The flowers," I said. "Oh." He put his sweaty arms around her, but she was still crying, and it wasn't what I had imagined what it would be. It was all sad instead of happy. The next morning, when I went into the kitchen, my father was standing beside the table, looking at 2 small dishes of blackberries, still shiny and wet with dew. One dish at his place and one at mine. "Thanks," I said. "No, it wasn't me," he said. "It was your mother." Just then, she came in from the back porch. My father put his arms around her, and they smooched, and it was all tremendously romantic, and I started to turn away, but my mother caught my arm. She pulled me to her and said to me, though it was meant for my father, I think, "See, I'm almost as good as your father." She said it in a shy way, laughing a little. I felt betrayed, but I didn't know why. It is surprising all the things you remember just by eating a blackberry pie.